I've been a captain for 22 years, and I can tell you every rivet, every wire, every single plumbing line on the Salubison. Or at least, I thought I could. The call from housekeeping came just as we cleared the port of Miami, a simple report about something stuck under the bed in stateroom 7138. I expected a broken piece of luggage. What I found was a heavy, rust-pitted iron ring, the kind you'd see on a century-old pier, bolted directly through the cabin floor. When my chief engineer arrived and saw what was fastened to the steel deck, he went completely pale and whispered, "Captain, that's impossible." What would you do? Would you have the courage to investigate it? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and tell me which city you're watching from, because the truth of what we were dragging beneath us was far worse than impossible. My name is Elias Vance. For 35 years, the sea has been my only constant, and for the last 22 of those, the MS Serenity has been my home, my kingdom, my entire world. At 57, a man tends to believe he's seen all the surprises the ocean has to offer. You think you've memorized every current, every cloud formation, every groan and sigh of the steel leviathan you command. From the bridge, with the endless blue stretching out before me, I felt a sense of order that life on land could never provide. Every morning began the same: a cup of black coffee, brought by my steward, William Carter, a brief with my first officer, Andrew Coleman, and the familiar, comforting thrum of the engines vibrating up through the soles of my shoes. It was a rhythm I knew better than my own heartbeat. The ship was more than a vessel. It was a living entity, and I knew its anatomy down to the last bolt, or so I believed. That day was no different from 1,000 others. The Miami skyline had just dissolved into a hazy line behind us, the water shifting from the murky green of the port to the impossible turquoise of the Caribbean. The air was warm, salty, and filled with the promise of another perfect voyage to the Bahamas. Passengers were laughing on the Lido deck. The steel drum band was just starting their first set, and my helmsman, a steady young man named Samuel Brooks, held us on a course as straight as an arrow. Everything was precisely as it should be. The call came through on my private line, a polite interruption from the head of housekeeping. She reported a minor issue in stateroom 7138, on the starboard side. A passenger from the previous cruise had apparently left something behind, something stuck under the bed that her staff couldn't move. I remember feeling a flicker of annoyance. It was trivial: a broken suitcase wheel, a piece of exercise equipment wedged against the frame. Things like that happened all the time. But I was meticulous. I believed that a captain's duty extended to every corner of his ship, not just the bridge. So instead of dispatching a maintenance crew, I decided to see it for myself. I walked the passenger corridors, the gentle rocking of the ship a familiar comfort. The sounds were all correct: the distant chime of a slot machine from the casino, the muffled music from the atrium, the quiet hum of the ventilation system. Nothing was out of place. When I arrived at 7138, the cabin steward, a new hire named Michael Hayes, was waiting nervously in the hallway. He gestured inside. The room was immaculate, the bed perfectly made, the scent of fresh linens in the air. It was a standard ocean view cabin, identical to hundreds of others. "Under the bed, Captain," Michael said, his voice barely a whisper. I sighed, expecting to get this over with quickly. I got down on one knee, the plush carpet compressing under my weight. I peered into the dark space beneath the bed frame. At first I saw nothing but shadow. I motioned for Michael to bring me a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and I saw it. It wasn't luggage. It wasn't forgotten property. It was a dark curved piece of metal, barely visible. It looked like a section of thick, rusted pipe. I frowned. How could a piece of pipe be in a passenger cabin? I told Michael to help me move the bed. Together we lifted the heavy frame and slid it away from the wall. And there, in the center of the room, my perfectly ordered world began to fracture. It was a ring, A massive, heavy, iron ring, the kind you'd see on a 100-year-old stone pier for mooring tall ships. It was pitted with rust and age, a dark reddish-brown against the pristine beige carpet. It was an artifact from another time, an object that had no business being here. My first thought was that it was an elaborate, foolish prank, but as I knelt closer, I saw that it was no joke. The ring was bolted directly through the carpet, through the padding, and into the steel deck plate of the ship itself. I ran my fingers over the enormous, hexagonal bolts. They were cold, solid, and fused to the floor with a terrifying permanence. They weren't new. The rust crept up their sides, blooming from the point where they met the metal. I tried to push the ring. It didn't budge. It was as much a part of the Serenity as her engines or her keel. A strange, coppery smell, like old blood and seawater, seemed to emanate from it. I stood up, my mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation. I have studied the blueprints of this ship until I could draw them from memory. I was there at the shipyard in Finland when her keel was laid. I know for a fact that Deck 7 is a solid, continuous sheet of high-tensile steel. There are no access hatches here, no service points, and certainly no century-old mooring rings bolted through the floor. It was impossible. The ship's gentle hum, once a source of comfort, now felt like a low growl. The vibration beneath my feet felt different, heavier, as if the ship was carrying a weight I had never known about. For the first time in 22 years, I felt like a stranger on my own vessel. It was a chilling, invasive feeling. What would you do in that moment? Standing in a quiet cabin in the middle of the ocean, faced with something that defies every law of your world, would you have the courage to find out what it was connected to? Or would you simply put the bed back, lock the door, and pretend you saw nothing? Let me know what you would have done in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and tell me which city you're watching from, because the truth of what we were dragging beneath us was far worse than impossible. My first instinct, standing there in the deafening silence of cabin 7138, was to cover it up, to simply slide the heavy bed frame back into place, smooth the duvet, and walk away. I could have marked the room as out of service for maintenance, and no one would have been the wiser. For a fleeting moment, that path seemed incredibly tempting. It was the path of order, of maintaining the perfect, placid surface of my well-run world. But I've been at sea too long to believe that what you ignore simply disappears. The ocean has a way of making you pay for your willful blindness. So I sent the nervous cabin steward away with a curt nod, telling him I would handle it personally. I needed to be alone with this impossibility. I knelt again, my knees sinking into the carpet beside the iron ring. The air in the climate-controlled room was still, but a strange, phantom chill seemed to radiate from the metal. It was a cold that felt ancient, a dampness that had no place on a modern vessel. I took out the small, heavy-duty multi-tool I always carry on my belt. I unfolded the pliers and tried to get a grip on the edge of one of the massive bolts. The serrated steel of my tool skidded across the rusted surface with a grating screech, leaving not so much as a scratch. The bolts were not just tight, they felt as if they had been forged into the very structure of the ship, as if they had grown there like a metallic fungus. I switched to the file, running it against the side of the ring itself. A fine red dust, like dried blood, fell onto the beige carpet. Beneath the rust, the metal was a dark, featureless gray, impossibly dense. It didn't look like any modern alloy I knew. I leaned closer, my ear almost touching the cold iron, and I tapped it with the handle of my tool. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the sharp, clear moss of steel on steel you'd expect. It was a dull, low duck, a sound that was absorbed almost immediately, as if the ring was connected to something immense, something that deadened any vibration. The sound didn't echo in the room. It seemed to travel downwards, into the very soul of my ship. I placed my palm flat against the deck next to the ring. I could feel the familiar, steady thrum of the engines, the lifeblood of the Serenity. But under that, I imagined I could feel something else. A faint, dissonant resonance, a drag. It was a sensation I'd never felt before. A subtle wrongness in the ship's rhythm. Was I imagining it? Was my mind, confronted with the illogical, starting to invent its own phantoms? This was no prank. The sheer engineering required to install something like this, to drill through a reinforced deck plate in the middle of a passenger cabin without anyone noticing, was staggering. It would require specialized, heavy equipment, and it would have made a tremendous amount of noise. It couldn't have been done on a turnaround day in port. It couldn't have been done at sea. It simply couldn't have been done at all. Yet here it was. My meticulously organized world, a world of blueprints and physics and predictable outcomes, had a gaping hole in it, and that hole was shaped like this rusty iron ring. I knew I was out of my depth. This wasn't a maintenance issue. This was something else entirely. I stood up, my mind made. There was only one person on this ship whose knowledge of its inner workings rivaled my own. A man who saw the Conarax's Serenity, not as a vessel, but as a complex living organism of steel, wire, and pipes. I called my chief engineer, Wei Chen, on his direct line. I kept my voice low and steady, a captain's calm that I did not feel. "Chen," I said, "I need you in stateroom 7138. Come alone and bring your diagnostic tablet and a fiber optic scope. And Chen, say nothing to anyone." There was a pause on the other end, the briefest hesitation. Chen was not a man for mysteries. He was a man of data and schematics. My request was so far outside our normal operating procedure that I knew it would set off alarms in his pragmatic mind. But he simply said, "On my way, Captain," and the line went dead. When he arrived minutes later, his face was a neutral mask of professionalism. But I saw his eyes scan the room, looking for a burst pipe, a fried electrical panel. When he saw me pointing to the floor, his expression shifted to one of pure confusion. He walked over and stared down at the ring. He didn't touch it, he just looked, his brow furrowed. "What am I looking at?" he asked, his voice quiet. "You tell me," I replied. "It's bolted through the deck." Chen knelt down, his movements precise and analytical. He ran a finger along the edge of the carpet where it met the base of the ring. Then he stood up and pulled out his tablet. His fingers flew across the screen, pulling up the detailed, multi-layered blueprints for Deck 7. He zoomed in on our exact location. A blue dot blinked on the screen, indicating our position. On the schematic, the floor beneath that blue dot was a solid, unbroken field of light gray, cross-hatched with structural supports 2 decks below. There was nothing there. No access hatch, no service port, no notation of any kind. He looked from the tablet to the ring, then back to the tablet. He did this 3 times. "Captain," he whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. "This is not possible. I have the as-built diagrams from the shipyard. There is nothing here. It's a continuous 30mm steel plate. Nothing goes through it." "And yet," I said, gesturing to the ring. He finally seemed to accept the reality of it. The engineer in him took over. "We can't see what's underneath," he said. "We can't cut into the deck without compromising structural integrity and causing a panic." He paused, then looked at the small gap, barely a finger's width, between the ring and the floor. "The scope," he said, more to himself than to me. He uncoiled the thin, flexible cable of the fiber optic camera. He carefully fed the tiny lens at its tip into the darkness beneath the ring. We both watched the small screen on his tablet, which flickered to life, showing a grainy, dark image. He maneuvered it slowly, the view shifting and tilting. For a moment, all we saw was the rough, corroded underside of the ring and the compressed fibers of the carpet padding. Then, he angled it down. The image stabilized. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just bolts we were seeing. Emerging from the center of the ring, descending directly through a perfectly circular hole in the steel deck plate that wasn't on any blueprint, was a chain. It was thick, monstrously so, each link as wide as my fist, It was covered in the same ancient, weeping rust as the ring. It stretched down into the absolute blackness between the decks. It wasn't just a ring, it was an anchor point. A tether. My ship, my perfectly balanced, precisely engineered kingdom, was chained to something. Something hidden in the dark. Would you have the courage to even consider pulling on that chain, to find out what was on the other end? Let me know in the comments what you would do. And if you want to know what we found lurking in the depths below us, make sure you subscribe, because our journey into the impossible was only just beginning. My ship was compromised. The word echoed in the silent cabin, a verdict delivered not by a court, but by a grainy image on a tablet screen. Chen and I stood there for what felt like an hour, the ship sailing smoothly on, its thousands of passengers laughing, dining, dancing, completely oblivious to the monstrous secret we were dragging through the abyss beneath their feet. The chain was a physical impossibility, but it was also a profound violation. It was a tether to a reality I refused to accept, yet could not deny. My first duty is to the safety of my passengers and crew. My second is to the integrity of my vessel. Both were now in jeopardy. My training, my experience, every protocol manual I had ever memorized screamed at me to call the Coast Guard, to report an unknown attachment to the hull. But I couldn't. Imagine the chaos. An announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We seem to have an unidentified object of unknown origin chained to the bottom of the ship. Panic would be instantaneous. It would be a stampede. We were in international waters, hours from the nearest port, equipped to handle a vessel of this size. A panicked ship is a dangerous ship. No, an external report was out of the question. At least for now. We were on our own. The solution had to come from within the skin of the Serenity itself. I looked at Chen, who was still staring at the tablet, cycling through structural diagrams as if trying to will the chain out of existence through sheer logic. We need to see what's at the end of it, I said, my voice low. Tonight. He looked up, his face pale in the glow of the screen. Captain, we're moving at 20 knots. The pressure, the drag, sending a diver down, is a suicide mission. Not a diver, I countered. The ROV. Every ship like the Serenity is equipped with a small, remote-operated vehicle for hull inspections and minor underwater repairs. It was a tool, a piece of equipment. Now it was about to become our periscope into a nightmare. The experts I assembled were not outsiders. They were my own people, the best on board. Besides Chen, I brought in Marcus Thorne, our head of marine engineering, a man with hands as scarred and reliable as the engines he maintained, and David Renwick, the stoic leader of our two-man emergency dive team, who knew more about the currents and pressures around a moving hull than anyone. We met in a small, windowless service office deep in the crew decks. I laid out the situation, showing them the fiber optic footage. I saw the same sequence of emotions play out on their faces that I had felt. Confusion, disbelief, then a slow, dawning dread. Thorne, a pragmatist, immediately started calculating the stress and drag on the hull. Renwick just stared at the image of the chain, his expression unreadable. There were no questions about how it got there. The impossibility of it was a given. The only question that mattered was, what do we do now? The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. We would claim a critical plumbing failure in the aft service corridor on Deck 2, giving us an excuse to seal it off. This corridor contained a small maintenance hatch, a reinforced plate in the hull used for deploying the ROV while at sea. It was a risky maneuver rarely performed outside of a dead calm. We were in the open Caribbean, with a steady 3-foot swell. At midnight, with the ship's casino at its loudest and the late-night deck parties in full swing, my team gathered in the sealed-off corridor. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and machinery. The only sounds were the distant, muffled throb of the propellers and the hum of the ROV's power unit. Renwick and his partner operated the deployment crane, their movements economical and precise. Chen and I huddled over the control console, the main video feed displayed on a ruggedized laptop. Hatch open. Renwick's voice crackled over the comms. I felt a subtle shift in the air pressure as a piece of my ship opened up to the deep. "Deploying ROV," he said. The small, yellow submersible, no bigger than a suitcase and bristling with lights and cameras, slid from its cradle and disappeared into the churning black water. The video feed flickered, then stabilized. The screen showed the familiar white-painted steel of the Serenity, S-hull rushing past, illuminated by the ROV's powerful LED lamps. Bubbles streamed by like frantic ghosts. "Taking her down," Chen murmured, his hands steady on the joysticks. The ROV descended, its camera pointed forward. We passed the colossal, wing-like stabilizers, which cut through the water with immense force. The chain came into view again, a rusted steel spine disappearing into the darkness below. It seemed to vibrate with the speed of our passage, taut and humming with a terrible energy. The depth gauge on the screen ticked downward. 40 feet. 50. The light from the ROV's lamps seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive blackness just a few yards from the lens. The only thing in the universe was our hull, that chain, and the crushing weight of the sea. At 75 feet, the ROV's thrusters whined, fighting the current. "There's something ahead," Thorne said, pointing at a flicker on the sonar display. Chen adjusted our heading, following the chain link by rusted link. The tension in that small corridor was suffocating. We were 4 men, surrounded by 3,000 souls, staring at a screen that showed a place no human was ever meant to see. And then, the lights found it. It emerged from the darkness slowly, a shape that had no business being there. It wasn't a piece of debris. It wasn't a lost shipping container. Tethered to my ship, dragged silently through the sea, was a small submersible. It was coffin-sized, as the premise had suggested, but the reality was far more disturbing. Its design was archaic, almost brutalist. There were no smooth hydrodynamic lines. It was a riveted iron box, angular and crude, as if built in a 19th century workshop. The entire surface was covered in a thick layer of barnacles and deep-sea growth, suggesting it had been down there for a very, very long time. A single dark viewport about the size of a dinner plate stared back at us from the front. It wasn't glass. It looked like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing of the ROV's bright lights. It was like a dead eye. Chen gasped beside me. "Captain, what is that?" "The pressure hull design is wrong. It's not military. It's not scientific. It's nothing I've ever seen." He was right. It bore no markings, no country of origin, no identification of any kind. It was a ghost, a parasite of iron and rust, latched onto the belly of my ship. The mystery was no longer what the ring was for. The mystery was now this tomb-like vessel. How long had it been there? Had it been attached since the ship was built? Had it been with us for 1 voyage, or for 1,000? Was it a relic from a forgotten age, or something else entirely? And the most terrifying question of all, the one that hung in the air unspoken between us, who, or what, was inside? Would you have the courage to even try to find out what was behind that dark, unblinking eye? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear the rest of this story, be sure to subscribe, because our voyage into the heart of this mystery was far from over. The ROV's lights painted the iron coffin in a sterile, clinical glow, but it did nothing to dispel the primeval dread that had settled in that small service corridor. 4 men, sworn to protect this ship, were now staring at proof that they had failed. We were compromised in a way none of us could have ever conceived. The silence was broken by Thorne, his voice a strained rasp. "Captain, we can't attach it. Not out here. The chain is under immense tension from the drag. If we try to cut it, the recoil could be catastrophic. It could snap back and punch through the hull like a spear." He was right. We were moving at 20 knots, dragging this thing through the water. Any attempt to sever the connection would be like trying to perform surgery in the middle of a hurricane. We were stuck with it. We retrieved the ROV, the little yellow machine seeming almost traumatized as it was winched back into the warm, dry air of the ship. We sealed the maintenance hatch, and the world outside the hull was once again a roaring, invisible abyss. But now we knew what was in it. Back in the corridor, under the harsh fluorescent lights, I looked at the faces of my men. Chen, the man of numbers and physics, looked like he'd seen a ghost. Thorne's hands were clenched into fists. Renwick, the diver, simply stared at the floor, as if he could see right through the steel plates to the horror we had just witnessed. "This stays between us," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Our official log will state that the inspection revealed a minor stress fracture on a stabilizer joint, which will require dry dock analysis. Nothing more. We complete this voyage as planned. No one on this ship is to know. Am I understood?" 3 grim nods were my answer. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I stood on the bridge, projecting an aura of calm command, while my mind was screaming. I would watch families laughing by the pool, couples dancing under the stars on the Lido deck, and I would feel like a complete fraud. They had placed their lives in my hands, trusting in the integrity of my ship, in my expertise. All the while I was hiding the fact that we were tethered to an iron tomb, dragging it through the turquoise waters of the Bahamas. Every creak of the ship, every unusual vibration from the engines, sent a spike of cold fear through my heart. Was the chain scraping against the hull? Was the immense drag putting a strain on the ship's frame that the designers had never accounted for? I found myself staring down at the water for hours, as if I could see the dark shape moving with us, a silent, parasitic twin to my brilliant white vessel. Chen and I barely spoke. We didn't need to. A shared glance across the bridge was enough. We were the keepers of a terrible secret, and the weight of it was crushing us. When we finally sailed back into the port of Miami, the sense of relief I expected never came. Instead, the dread intensified. As the first mooring lines were being secured, my first officer informed me that a, quote, special Port Authority delegation was waiting for me. They weren't from the Port Authority. They were 3 men in dark, ill-fitting suits, their faces devoid of expression. They met me in my private office. They didn't introduce themselves. The lead man simply placed a thin file on my desk. "Captain Vance," he said, his voice flat and cold. "The MS Serenity is being requisitioned under the National Security Act. Your crew and passengers will disembark as normal. You will then sail the vessel to the Naval Shipyard at Norfolk, Virginia. You will be accompanied by our personnel. Your crew will be limited to a skeleton staff of your choosing. Everyone involved in the ROV deployment will be required to sign a lifetime non-disclosure agreement." There was no negotiation. It was an order. I was no longer the master of my ship. I was a custodian, tasked with delivering a piece of evidence. The official story, fed to the cruise line and the media, was a critical failure in one of the Azipod propulsion units, an issue that required an immediate and extensive dry dock period. My crew, the men who had stood with me in that corridor, signed the papers without a word. What choice did we have? The journey to Virginia was silent and tense. The men in suits were a constant, quiet presence. They never asked what we found. They already knew. When we finally guided the Serenity into the cavernous, gray military dry dock, the real operation began. The area was sealed off by armed guards. They drained the dock, and for the first time, I saw the thing with my own eyes as the water receded. It was even more monstrous in the open air. Caked in decades of sea life, it hung from the belly of my ship like a malignant growth. I was ordered off my own vessel. I was never allowed back on the Serenity. I was reassigned 6 months later to a sister ship, the Tranquility. The official report on the Serenity's refit mentions only structural reinforcements and propulsion upgrades. Cabin 7138 no longer exists. It's a supply closet now. I was never told what they found inside that riveted iron box. Was it a listening device from a forgotten Cold War? A weapon? Or was it a tomb? Sometimes, when I'm on the bridge of this new ship, this perfect copy of my old home, I'll feel a phantom vibration under my feet. I'll look down at the endless churning blue of the ocean and feel a cold dread that never truly leaves me. We sail these steel islands across the surface of a world we know nothing about, confident in our charts and our sonar. But we never truly know what we're dragging along with us, just beneath the waves, hidden in the crushing dark. And you, what do you think was really behind all this? What secrets was that iron coffin built to keep? Let me know your theories in the comments. And if you believe there are more truths buried in the deep, subscribe and join the search for answers.